All right, let's talk about one of the biggest stories in tech recently. Intel, the absolute giant of the CPU world, decided to cannonball into the deep end of the consumer graphics card pool with their Arc series. The whole world was watching, hoping for a real third competitor to shake up the NVIDIA and AMD duo. So, what on earth happened? Let's get into it. I wanted to start with this quote from the YouTube channel High Yield because it just perfectly nails the vibe around this whole launch. This isn't just a simple story of a product that kind of missed the mark. No. This is a train wreck you just can't look away from. A fascinating case study in how something with so much money and talent behind it could go so spectacularly off the rails. So first things first, the debut. Let's just look at how these cards actually stack up when you fire up a game. Now look, Intel was super clear about who they were going after. They weren't trying to take on the $1,000 flagships. Nah. They were aiming right for the heart of the market, the mainstream, with their A770 and A750 cards. Their target? The ridiculously popular NVIDIA RTX 3060. This was supposed to be a battle for the average gamer. And if you just glance at some 1440p gaming benchmarks, you might kind of squint and go, hey, this isn't so bad. The A770, it trades blows with the 3060, sometimes it's a little faster, and the A750 is right in there. But, and believe me, this is a huge but, this is the absolute most flattering best case scenario for Intel. The full picture is a whole lot messier. Here's the thing about average frames per second. It can lie. The real problem here is consistency. Weirdly enough, the performance actually gets worse at lower resolutions like 1080p, thanks to some serious driver issues. And even when the average FPS looks okay, the frame times, those tiny gaps between each frame, are all over the place. That means you get a stuttery, choppy, just plain frustrating experience. Okay, so performance is shaky. But that's just scratching the surface. The first really big clue that something is fundamentally broken with these cards is how much power they drink. So when you're gaming, Intel's cards are sucking down a staggering 50 to 60% more power than their direct AMD rival just to get similar performance. Let me put that another way. They're using more juice than a much faster, higher-end RTX 3070 just to try and keep up with a mid-range RTX 3060. That's not good. But it gets so much worse. Seriously, if this next number doesn't make your jaw drop, I don't know what will. When your computer is just sitting there, at idle, doing nothing, the Arc cards pull over 900% more power. 900%. That is not a typo. Your PC basically turns into a space heater while you're just checking your email. And look, this isn't something you can just fix with a simple driver patch. No way. When you see this level of wild inefficiency, both when you're gaming and when you're doing nothing at all, it's a giant red flag pointing to a deep, fundamental problem with the chip's architecture itself. Which brings us right to the heart of the matter. We've seen the symptoms, the shaky performance, the insane power draw, so now let's look at the cause. And the cause is literally etched into the silicon. So how does this happen? How can a company like Intel, of all companies, get something so wrong? Well, the answer becomes painfully obvious once you stop looking at the marketing and start looking at the actual physical specs of the chip. Okay, this is it. This is the smoking gun. Intel's chip, the ACM G10, is packing nearly 22 billion transistors on a massive 406 square millimeter die. Now, just look at the competition. NVIDIA and AMD are getting the exact same performance, with roughly half the transistors on chips that are way smaller. This is everything you need to know right here. To put it as simply as I can, Intel built a chip that is physically the size of a high-end graphics card. It's a piece of silicon that should be competing with something like an RTX 3070. But the performance they're actually getting out of it, it's down in the mainstream RTX 3060 territory. They built a heavyweight boxer that hits like a welterweight. This just puts the sheer scale of the failure into perspective. The engineering gap is so huge, it's like they're not even playing the same game. Something went terribly wrong way back in the design phase. And an engineering failure this big leads directly to an unavoidable business disaster. Let's talk about why this giant chip size makes it completely impossible for Intel to actually make money here. So, to get why, we have to talk about die size. It's really simple. It's just the physical area of the chip. And in the world of silicon, there's one golden rule. Bigger is always more expensive to make. You get fewer chips out of a single silicon wafer, and the chance of a tiny defect ruining a whole chip goes way up. And here is the absolutely devastating result of that. Because Intel's chip is so enormous, it costs them more to make their mainstream A770 than it costs NVIDIA or AMD to make their higher-end, much faster cards like the RTX 3070. Just let that sink in for a second. Their mid-range card is more expensive to build than the competition's premium cards. And the future? It looks even worse. The competition is already moving on. AMD's next-generation equivalent chip is literally half the size, which means they can make 2, maybe even more for every one chip Intel can produce. There is just no way for Intel to win a price war. It is economic suicide. This is exactly why that $329 launch price was called a death sentence. They can't price it any higher because the performance just isn't there. But at that price, given how expensive it is to make, they are almost certainly lighting a huge pile of money on fire with every single card they manage to sell.
So where does all this leave Intel? The silicon is flawed from the ground up. The business model is a complete disaster, which brings us to the final, really tough question about the future of this whole project.
And you have to remember, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Intel, as a whole company, is facing some serious financial headwinds and losing money in other key areas. They simply don't have the luxury of pouring billions and billions of dollars into a GPU division that is hemorrhaging cash like this. Which brings us to this incredibly stark prediction from the source material. When you look at the financial reality of it all, the entire consumer Arc GPU project could be on the chopping block. The math just doesn't work. So to wrap it all up, Intel designed a chip that's way too big and way too power-hungry for the pretty mediocre performance it delivers. And because it's so expensive to actually make, it's trapped in a price bracket where they simply can't afford to sell it. And that leaves us with the final question. And I'll just leave this with you to think about. Look, we all wanted a third player in the graphics card market, right? Competition is good for everyone. But based on all this evidence, is there any realistic path forward for Intel in the space? Thanks for joining this explainer.